Um, we're in the Parliament today. We have a couple of special guests, and I'd like them to introduce themselves now.
John Story, the Director of Law and Policy at the Institute of Public Affairs, and I head up our free speech research.
And I'm Michael Shellenberger. I'm the CBR Chair of Politics, Censorship, and Free Speech at the University of Austin, and the founder of Public, which is the #1 news site on Substack.
Fantastic. John, why did you bring a dear friend from out here?
Well, it's the view of the IPA that the government's proposed misinformation and disinformation bill is the greatest assault on free speech in Australia's peacetime history. We've been saying that consistently from when the bill was first proposed last year. We knew that it was coming close to a vote, and we thought that we wanted many people to be as informed as possible about how this would work, including its impacts internationally. And I connected with Michael, whose reputation as an advocate of free speech was outstanding, and he had done work on the Twitter files, which he'll talk about, which was a model for how this would work. Government telling social media companies what they should and shouldn't allow on their platforms. So we wanted to get someone, an expert out here to talk to people, and there's a vote next week if the vote holds, and so it's perfect timing to be talking to people.
Great. Michael, you didn't choose this path chose you. Tell us how you ended up coming down this freedom of speech line.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, I've been reporting on issues of energy and the environment, and on crime, drugs, and homelessness in the United States. And when Elon Musk bought Twitter in the fall of 2022, he invited in 2 journalists, much more famous than me, but one of them is a friend of mine, Barry Weiss, and she invited me in. And we had full access to the internal emails and messages of Twitter employees. The first thing we discovered was that there was a strong political bias against disfavored views. It was something like 95% of all political donations from Twitter staff were to Democrats. So we saw that they did the things that you would imagine. They literally had a blacklist that had both famous conservatives, but also just people that were dissidents on COVID, including Stanford University professor Jay Bhattacharya, who could be, we suspect, maybe the next director of the NIH in the United States. But then it got even weirder, because we started to discover emails from the FBI, from the Department of Homeland Security, which was created after 9/11 to prevent terrorism and to coordinate intelligence and law enforcement in the United States. And that literally sent chills up our spines. I mean, and particularly Matt Taibbi and I, who came from the left, radical left, even in the 80s and 90s, and had always had a suspicious view of, and wanting to put constraints on the intelligence community. We were shocked by this, and ultimately what we discovered was a fairly elaborate effort by the Department of Homeland Security to create a censorship industrial complex that consisted of government-funded but also privately funded NGOs to supposedly fact-check, to really just repeat the conventional wisdom in the news media and demand that ordinary citizens be censored on social media without even knowing it. And this happened both on the 2020 elections, then also on COVID in 2021. There was much more to it, but that basic model is then something that, as soon as we started looking around in the spring of 2023, we discovered that same model of censorship was being advocated around the world, including in Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, the European Union, Canada, and that there was some relationship between the people that were advocating for it and also the strategy and tactics that they were using.
And we don't know what that connection is that right?
We definitely see characters that have very strong relationships to the intelligence community. It's often 1 degree removed. The most important leader of the censorship efforts in the United States was a former CIA person. She's admitted to that. We see in Australia an American named Julie Inman Grant, who on her arrival to Australia said that she'd been recruited by the CIA, which is a very odd thing to say. She said, well, I didn't accept the offer. We see the former head of Wikipedia, now the head of National Public Radio in the United States, has been accused of running CIA operations during the Arab Spring. And the basic picture is that the the U.S. government and in particular, and specifically the CIA and the National Endowment for Democracy, which runs so-called pro-democracy efforts, they were using social media in the Arab Spring and in the color revolutions in Eastern Europe. It appears that what happened is that with the populist revolts that were occurring thanks to social media, really from 2014 through 2016, that this desire for censorship in our own countries was a kind of blowback of the intelligence community coming here to do counter-populism in the United States and use the same tools that they had practiced and perfected abroad.
Right. In 2023, I wrote to Peter Dutton explaining that this legislation offends my party, the Liberal Party at the time, its values and what it stands for. How did this legislation get into Australia?
We don't know. I mean, there's a huge number of questions that we don't have.
Because you're explaining to me,
yes,
it's legislation from around the world, or the drive. There might be nuances in our legislation that are a bit different to Canada or the US, but it's the same stuff.
It is, and so, I mean, we see a lot of different connections. So there's a very concerted effort at the World Economic Forum where all of the heads of state get together and they've talked about the need to fight misinformation. There's an active effort at the United Nations where they talk about the need to fight misinformation. We see the Soros-funded NGOs have very similar activities in all these different countries. And there's often some connection to the intelligence or security agencies. To give you a sense of it, that's very hidden. When our Brazilian friends were investigating what was behind their censorship efforts, they at first didn't find anything, and then we said, well, look a little harder, and they discovered that the FBI had come down to Brazil to work with the Brazilians on fighting misinformation. So we know that the CIA and the intelligence community has often acted through NGOs. In the post-war era, the CIA was famous to work through labor unions and business groups, but it's clearly, we can see their influence in NGOs. We're about to come out with a report of about 150 individual people that we think are advocates for censorship, that we think have very strong ties to the intelligence community. We get a better picture of it, but obviously a lot of it is still invisible to us, and we're still trying to figure out what exactly happened and how they did it.
Well, you know how you found the interference from agencies in the US? Well, there was interference here, John will tell you, during COVID, about the tweets that were allowed to progress within community, Facebook, YouTube, etc., etc. In fact, one of my parliamentary speeches was removed from YouTube. I mean, it's on the parliamentary record of what I said, but it was good enough for Parliament, but apparently not good enough for YouTube.
Well, you're a victim of censorship. I'm also a victim of censorship by Facebook, not by YouTube or Google. But that story is very common. I mean, censorship has affected millions of people, and often without even knowing it. And I think it's important for people to understand, this is a point that I keep trying to make, the only way to fight misinformation is with more information. You cannot fight misinformation with censorship, because if you have a bad idea out there, you have to argue with it in public. Moreover, what we see them censoring is often accurate information. People were censored for saying that they thought COVID leaked from a lab. Well, a majority of US intelligence agencies now think that COVID leaked from a lab. People were censored for saying that the vaccine didn't stop infection or transmission and had some side effects. That turned out to be totally accurate. We now have Mark Zuckerberg, the owner of Meta and Facebook and Instagram, sent a letter earlier this year saying to the Republicans, effectively apologizing and saying that he had been under pressure from the FBI to censor the Hunter Biden laptop story. He also said he regretted being pressured by the US government to censor stories about COVID as a lab leak. And we also have documentation of the White House directly pressuring Facebook to censor what Facebook executives called often true stories of vaccine side effects from ordinary parents sharing stories about themselves or their kids getting sick. It's hard to imagine anything more of a violation than preventing people from sharing stories about a side effect of a medicine. I come from the left in the United States, the progressive movement. We fought for decades to require the drug companies to list the side effects so that to tell a mom that she can't warn her friends and neighbors there have been some side effects from these vaccines is absolutely unethical. And as it would turn out, it actually makes people more suspicious of the vaccine. So if you want to increase vaccine hesitancy, then you should go ahead and censor people.
Now, I just want to test you on, you said you're from the left, and you said some of your friends were from the radical left.
Yes.
Who, one of the things that you were worried about all those years ago was the fact that the agencies were attacking the left. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
So,
and it's important to remember that.
so this is a pretty radical position for you to take today.
Well, I mean, so I'm famous for having changed my mind on some big questions like nuclear power or homelessness. I've never changed my mind on free speech, and I think the natural suspicion that we should have of our intelligence and security agencies, I support security and national security. I want to keep safe and protected, but you have to be careful because there's such a tendency to abuse those powers by the people in those agencies, often for political reasons. And so I think one thing I have to remind my friends on the left of is that all of the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the right for sexual minorities, all of those movements required free speech. And they often had to fight against censorship. In fact, it's one of the test cases in the United States Supreme Court was an ad for Martin Luther King's civil rights movement in the New York Times. So the idea that you would need to censor speech in order to protect racial minorities should be viewed as offensive by everybody, all free citizens. And so yes, I think that when I see something like this, or you see people in the United States, you may know that many Democrats came to support Trump, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Tulsi Gabbard,
And there'll be
Elon
more.
Musk.
And there'll be more.
And there'll be more
Watch,
because
yeah.
you can see for whatever reason, the left the Democrats decided to cede free speech to the Republicans, which I think will go down as one of the most catastrophic political decisions in the 21st century.
Well, I think it's amazing that you've actually taken the time to come out here. If you were able to speak directly to the Prime Minister today, what would you say?
Prime Minister, what would I say? I would say please reconsider this legislation. We all know what it's like to have people ridicule you on social media. It's not pleasant. I've been there myself. But the best solution to speech that you disagree with or that you find offensive is to talk back to it or ignore it. That nobody is helped, certainly not you, by censoring legitimate questions. This legislation is so broad, it would allow the censoring of jokes, of sarcasm, of irony. You would see some of the greatest humorists in history be censored by this legislation. So please rethink what you're doing. This is a dangerous weapon of censorship that you're proposing, and it will be used against your own people and your own party if this legislation is allowed to pass.
Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Senator. I appreciate it.
It's a real pleasure. It's to you, John.
No worries.
We're very grateful as a nation that you actually brought Michael out here.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
It's been fantastic.